We begin today's show looking at the U.S. Supreme Court's gutting of a key part of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. On Wednesday, in a 6-3 decision, the court struck down Louisiana's voting map that was designed to create a second majority black district in the state, where African Americans have long faced racial segregation and barriers to voting. The 6 conservative justices on the court ruled Louisiana's map, quote, relied too heavily on race and unfairly favored black voters over white voters. In her dissent, Justice Elena Kagan described the ruling as the, quote, latest chapter in the majority's now completed demolition of the Voting Rights Act. Kagan warned that the ruling will give states the power to draw congressional maps to disenfranchise voters of color. She wrote, quote, minority voters can now be cracked out of the electoral process.
Republican politicians rapidly seized on Wednesday's ruling. The Washington Post reports Louisiana Governor Jeff Landry told Republican House candidates he plans to suspend the May 16th primary elections so state lawmakers can pass a new congressional map first. Meanwhile, in a special session on Wednesday, Florida lawmakers approved a new congressional map designed to give Republicans 4 additional U.S. House seats in the midterm elections in November. On Wednesday, members of the Congressional Black Caucus gathered to condemn the Supreme Court ruling. This is Alabama Congressmember Terry Sewell.
Today, the far-right Supreme Court has dealt a devastating blow to our democracy and to the Voting Rights Act of 1965. It will pave the way for the greatest reduction in representation for black and minority voters since the years following Reconstruction. What the court did today makes it easier for bad state actors to silence the voices of black voters and harder to challenge the discrimination in court. With this decision, the extremists on the Supreme Court have completed their decades-long crusade to gut the Voting Rights Act of 1965. They willingly dismiss generations of legal precedent, of congressional intent, and the will of the American people. In doing so, they have given a green light to Donald Trump's partisan voter suppression scheme. Instead of responding to the will of the people and changing course, Trump and Republicans are trying to erode our democracy and suppress the vote to escape accountability at the ballot box. They're looking to steal the election. Yes. And we in the Congressional Black Caucus say no. No. We say hell no.
Hell no.
Not without a fight. I am a daughter of Selma, Alabama, and I grew up in the shadow of the civil rights movement. The foot soldiers who marched across that bridge were my neighbors, my church members, my parishioners, and my babysitters. I am here to tell you that the progress secured by those foot soldiers is being erased before our very eyes. And we say no.
No.
We say hell no.
Hell no.
Not on our watch.
That was Democratic Congressmember Terry Sewell of Alabama. We're joined now by Maya Wiley, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, longtime civil rights attorney. Maya, thanks so much for being with us. If you can address our global audience and talk about the significance of the Voting Rights Act and what happened with yesterday's ruling.
Well, first of all, Amy, thank you for having me and thank you for this conversation. This is central to whether or not we maintain a multiracial democracy in this country and a real way for Black people, for Latinos, for Native Americans and Asian Americans to have a real opportunity to say who leads us. It is that simple, but if you put it in context, let's put it in context. You know, not only you heard from Representative Terry Sewell, who is an amazing leader on voting rights, and from the place where Black people marched along with white allies and faced not just attack, even threats of death, hospitalization, simply for peacefully marching for the right to vote. I say that because what they won by putting their bodies on the line was the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, the nation's largest and most diverse civil rights coalition, helped win. But what winning the Voting Rights Act did was take us from a place where there was virtually no representation in Congress or in state houses, because even in states like Alabama, like Louisiana, like so many other states where we had large percentages of Black people, also later Latinos as that population has grown, and Asian Americans, or in states with Native American populations that are large, did not have people who had to be accountable, because you could simply gerrymander, draw a map that was not fair in terms of interests of community, of the types of things communities would demand, that enabled people to get together and say, who's going to be our candidate? Who's going to solve our problems? Who's going to show up and speak to our needs? And we changed that because essentially Congress did something extremely important. It said, you know what? Yes, intentional discrimination we know is unconstitutional. But what we have is a country that has segregated people by race. What we have as a country is such a long history of hiding the ability to steal power from Black people or from Latinos in all kinds of ways that don't even have to name it. We're going to look at the impact. If the impact on a voting decision, on a way of organizing the process of voting, means that the effect is that a large number of Black people or Latinos or anybody based on race will not have a fair opportunity to decide who leads us, that violates the Voting Rights Act. And the reason that was so critical is, you know, even if it was bean counting or naming the number of judges that existed in state courts, or all the ridiculous things that were thrown as intentional hurdles to Black people voting in the South, for example, didn't say race, didn't name it. And so what Justice Alito and this really radicalized right-wing majority did was say, because we think that we shouldn't be able to say anything about partisan politics, we're not just going to create a loophole. We're going to create the sunken place where essentially any politicians who are controlling the politics of a state can just say, we're not discriminating. We just want to win. And we will win if Black people can't have a district where they have the ability to say who leads them. Because rather than competing for our votes, rather than trying to find the kinds of coalitions of the willing to create and create solutions to problems we all share, they'd rather just figure out a way to stay in power. That means state house races, that means school board races, but it also means who leads us in this country and whether or not we have a congressional Black caucus who makes arguments for civil rights, but also for things like access to healthcare, or a Latino caucus where we have enough political power to say you can't ignore how we are being treated. And the Supreme Court said we will turn not only a blind eye, we will have our eyes wide open and say, you can't prove it.
So, Maya, the principal provision in the Voting Rights Act is Section 2, which this ruling has effectively eviscerated. If you could explain what Section 2 calls for.
Yeah, and that's what I was just summarizing was basically what Section 2 says. So first of all, let me just say this, because especially not just for a global audience, for a national audience, the context in which Representative Sewell said this is a decades-long fight to take away our rights and our ability to have leaders who look like us and who represent us. And that is that this Supreme Court said, first of all, took away Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act. This is a section that said, you know, there has been so many shenanigans in blocking people of color, Black, Latino, Native American, Asian, from being able to vote, that we need a provision that says you have to get pre-clearance. If you have a long history of racial discrimination in this area, you have to have the Department of Justice say it's okay how you draw your electoral map or how you design other systems around voting, like early voting systems or where you have polling sites. And when this Supreme Court in 2013 said, you know what, we're going to say you haven't, history has changed. We're doing such a great job in the United States. You don't have to do that anymore. That opened the floodgates, for now what created a huge gap in voter turnout, because we just had barrier after barrier after barrier thrown in our way, including on how maps were drawn. That means we have states that aren't representing the real population of those states. But Section 2 remained. Section 2 said, okay, but you can still sue. You can still bring a lawsuit if a state does anything that has the effect of making it harder for you to have a real opportunity as a Black community, as a Latino community, as a Native American community, to say who leads us, to participate in the process of voting. If it impacts you and it is clear that it impacts you, then we're going to say it's not okay. We're going to say it's discriminatory. What this Supreme Court said is really hard to prove intent. In fact, it's so hard to prove intent that we're going to say, even though Congress said you don't have to show that someone hates you, you don't have to show that any politicians are saying we just don't want Black people voting, we're going to say it's fine to prevent large numbers of Black people from being represented, or make it harder for large numbers of Latino people to get access to a poll, or Native Americans. We're going to say that's okay unless you can show us a rabid racist. Even though Congress said, no, it's just about the effect. It's just about the outcome. So when they did this yesterday, what they were saying, and what Justice Kagan in her dissent said, is, y'all just giving them a free pass to discriminate. And all they have to do it is say, it's just good for Republicans. And I'm saying that because that's who's running around right now saying, let's change all our maps. Democrats are now going to do it too, had started doing it. But it's just creating a new kind of civil war about who wants to have our votes. And if you're already in control in a state house, all you have to do to discriminate is say, yeah, it's just good for our party.
Well, and the New York Times reported, and this is in terms of the midterms coming up later this year, that hours after the ruling, Florida's legislature approved a new map that could give Republicans as many as 4 new seats in the state's congressional delegation, and other states are expected to follow. If you could talk about the implications of that.
Yeah, I mean, this is why this opinion is a devastating blow, because it has literally, states have been organizing around this for a while. And as we know, Donald Trump asked for states like Texas, other states, to rig their maps to guarantee an outcome for Republicans so they could hold on to that, to the US Congress, to the House. And it was blatant. Right? But what that means is you go for people of color. You go to draw maps that we call either packing or cracking communities of color. We've got racial segregation. We've got communities that are majority people of some kind of color. They're not without some diversity, but where there really is a large segment of people who live near each other, have shared interests. And so Republicans started preparing those maps. In some instances, we're already passing them. That's why we had this lawsuit in the first place. And then, but as we have seen, they were just waiting for permission to say, it's politics, it's partisan. And so Florida's had a long stretch of this. By the way, let's remember, for many in your audience may not remember this, after Barack Obama won election in 2008, and as we were approaching the 2012 elections, we saw all of a sudden claims that there was voter fraud, that undocumented immigrants were voting, that we had to make it much more difficult to prove you had the ability to vote lawfully. And what that did was disenfranchise a lot of people of color. But we had Republican Party head in Florida, Republican Party head in Pennsylvania saying that quiet part out loud is, we can deliver an election this way. And so it's not surprising to now see Florida or Louisiana or Alabama or Missouri, any of these states saying, game on. Now we're going to use this to make sure that large segments of our population who are people of color don't count.
Maya Wiley, I want to ask you about another attack on civil rights. Last week, the Justice Department indicted the SPLC, the Southern Poverty Law Center, on an 11-count federal fraud case. The case centers on the center's history of paying people to infiltrate white supremacist groups, including the Ku Klux Klan, the Aryan Nation, and the National Alliance. The Southern Poverty Law Center rejected the charges as politically motivated, saying its informant program was used to monitor threats of violence and that the information gathered was routinely shared with local and federal law enforcement. On Sunday, President Trump spoke to 60 Minutes and claimed without proof that the deadly white nationalists Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville in 2017 was, quote, all funded by the Southern Poverty Law Center.
I see these no kings, which are funded just like the Southern Law was funded. You saw all that. Southern Law is financing the KKK and lots of other radical, terrible groups. And then they go out and they say, oh, we've got to stop the KKK, and yet they give them hundreds of thousands and even millions of dollars. It's a total scam run by the Democrats. It shows you that, like Charlottesville was all funded by the Southern Law. That was a Southern Law deal, too. And it was done to make me look bad, and it turned out to be a total fake. It basically was a rigged election. This was a part of the rigging of the election.
So, Maya Wiley, you recently wrote an article headlined, Why I Support the Southern Poverty Law Center. Can you explain the SPLC, what it is, and the significance of this indictment?
I certainly can, and it's connected to the conversation we just had. First of all, let me be candid. The Southern Poverty Law Center is a member organization of our over 200 national organizational coalition that is the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. I know them well. I work with them. Let me just say this. Its history is founded on fighting racism, fighting hatred, and fighting extremism. It is its mission, and it is one that it acquitted when people were bombed for demanding their civil rights by racists, by extremists. It brought the Ku Klux Klan, after it lynched a black man in the early 1980s, brought a civil rights suit that bankrupted it. It runs a tracking program to identify hate groups, track whether they're growing or shrinking. They did this after January 6th. They had been tracking the Proud Boys and the Oath Keepers, the foot soldiers of the violence in January 6th. Remember, the Proud Boys are the ones that Donald Trump himself, when he ran for president, it's told to stand by as if they were at his command, and that was before January 6, 2021. The Unite the Right rally was the very rally that Donald Trump had said they're good and bad people on both sides when they were chanting, Jews will not replace us, when their links to anti-Semitism, neo-Nazism, and white supremacy was clear. And the reason I'm saying this is what Southern Poverty Law Center has done is, in addition to ensuring that people know about their rights to vote, in addition to fighting for voting rights in the South, in addition to doing all the things it can to ensure that people have a voice about whether or not they can see a doctor when they're sick, or whether or not they have a fair wage for the work they do. That the other thing they do is track hate in this country. But that has exposed allies of Donald Trump. It has exposed people who are in its administration. It has exposed the very connections that he himself has publicly stated, or that people he is in close relationship have publicly been seen in relationship with. The reason I say all of that is because when I stand by them because I know what this is. It's political persecution because you have some power of advocacy in voice around the very civil rights we have been fighting for in this country so that we have a democracy that serves all our needs. And they track hate across the board, not with political ideology other than whether it's extremism. And it matters so much because we're watching a politics that is trying to erase the fact that racism exists. Todd Blanche on announcing this indictment, said it out loud. He said, they're trying to say that racism is real when it's not. That's basically what he said. Those aren't his words, but those were the import of his words. Donald Trump has publicly said that the civil rights laws hurt white men. That's actually a white nationalist trope and talking point. Not to mention how many times we've seen white supremacy and neo-Nazism, the rise of hate and anti-Semitism in this country. SPLC's been fighting it. So all I can say is there's a pattern in the development of tyranny in countries across the globe where the person who wants to have that power finds ways to discredit the lawful advocacy of organizations that are fighting to ensure that democracy survives. But democracy doesn't survive in lies, and everything we just heard was a lie.
We just have 10 seconds. Do you think other groups are next? You represent scores of groups similar to the SPLC.
We've had hundreds of organizations refuse to be afraid of this administration weaponizing government against lawful activity. Hundreds have. But one of the reasons is because everyone understands that this administration has been signaling in multiple ways that it is going to find ways to punish anyone it disagrees with. So yes, I expect that we will see this audition from Todd Blanche to be the people's lawyer is Todd Blanche's audition to show, I'll go after anyone you want me to because we don't like them.
Maya Wiley, I want to thank you for being with us, President and CEO of the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights, ran for mayor in 2021. Thanks for watching Democracy Now! On YouTube. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications to make sure you never miss a video. And for more of our audience-supported journalism, go to democracynow.org, where you can download our news app, sign up for our newsletter, subscribe to the daily podcast, and so much more.